Hello, my lovely sweet potatoes. Boy, do I have a story for you. Familicide. What do you get when you cross a wealthy farmer, a brutal familicide, 1950s America, and an expert photographer? A spectacular, strange story that would inspire true crime novels for decades to come. This is the story of the Clutter family. Woo! In the early morning hours of November 15th, 1959, 4 bodies were discovered in a quaint Kansas home. The bodies were confirmed to have all been members of the Clutter family. Herb, his wife, Bonnie, and their teenagers, Nancy and Kenyon. You guys, this case was so shocking and so horrific that it's apparently one of the cases that birthed the true crime genre of books in America and kind of started the whole fascination with true crime as a topic. Truman Capote actually wrote a book based on the Clutter family, and to this day, it's the second best-selling true crime story in history, after Helter Skelter, of course. Anyone down to start a book club? Anyone? A lot of people were actually shocked to find out that Truman's book was based on another true story, and it wasn't just a work of fiction. Okay, so if this family was such a hot topic, who were they? And what on earth could they have possibly gotten themselves into? I'm so glad that you asked, hypothetical audience member. Now let's get into it. So Herbert Clutter, also known as Herb, was a successful farmer who lived out in western Kansas. He had 4 children. The 2 oldest girls were adults who had already moved out, and the other 2 kids were around high school age. The Clutter family lived in a tiny town of Holcomb, Kansas, which had a population of just 270 people. It was the kind of town that you always hear about in simpler times. Everyone knew everybody, no one locked their doors, and nothing bad ever happened. If I had a nickel every time I heard that one. So Herb was widely respected throughout the agricultural world. He was super successful and had acquired quite a bit of dough throughout his career. The Clutter family lived in this 14-room house out on the farm, and it was clear just by looking at it that the family was very wealthy. Wait, hold on. 14 rooms? Dude, that's a big house. Can you imagine the games of hide and go seek played in that house? Those games must have been epic. So besides the giant farmhouse though, Herb was never known to flaunt or show off his money. The family was humble, attended church, and had tons of friends, and they were really well loved throughout the whole community. Their one daughter, Nancy, was described by friends as not having a mean bone in her body. And her brother, Kenyon, was this sweet, energetic, and playful kid. But the neighbors never would have suspected that November 14, 1959 would be the last day the Clutter family would ever be seen alive again. So every Sunday, Nancy's 2 friends would stop by the Clutter's house to pick her up, and they'd all go to church together. But on a specific Sunday when the girls showed up, they knocked on the door and no one answered. The girls were confused because they could see the car in the garage. Well, they kept knocking and still no response. They decided to call the Clutter's home phone, and much to their dismay, they couldn't seem to get through. The Clutters did have company over the night before, so it's possible the girls knew that and assumed that they had overslept. I mean, I've got to imagine that the church on Sunday in the 50s was probably at the crack of dawn, so they could get back in time to milk the cows or whatever. I'm not a farmer, I'm just spitballing here. But the girls hadn't given up yet. After their failed phone call, they went around to the back door where they continued knocking. I mean, it's a big 14-room house. Maybe the family couldn't hear them, but still nothing. So the girls decided they were going to be a little nosy and go in through the front door. And because no one locks their doors, remember I told you that's a small town, and so they slowly crept inside, and the house was eerily quiet. The 2 girls called out Nancy's name, and of course, no response. So they went upstairs to her room, and now they're just really hoping that they were going to find Nancy asleep, and they'd wake her up, and they'd have a good laugh and sing songs all day. But I think you guys can guess it, Nancy wasn't asleep. Once Nancy's gal pals made it to her bedroom, they opened the door and saw streaks of red up and down the walls before spotting Nancy's motionless body lying on her bed. That is literally one of the worst things I can think of. Like, those poor girls. I hope they had some means of therapy back then, because I can't imagine what it would be like to go through that. So one of the girls' dads was waiting outside for them, and at this point he was starting to wonder what was taking them so long. So he ended up walking into the house as well. The first thing he noticed was that the phone was off the receiver and the phone line had been cut. To our younger viewers watching, telephones used to sit on these things called receivers, and they were actually attached to them by these long cords. I know, I'm aging myself. And also, you only had one phone in your home. It was called the home phone. I know, very clever, right? And by now, the girls had run out of the room and were telling the dad what they saw. Then they all hightailed it out of there and went over to the neighbor's place to call the police. When the police got there and began to walk around the home, the things they started finding in each room just were downright horrifying. Herb was found in the basement where the furnace was. He had been bound, gagged, slit in the throat, and had a hole in the front of his head. I told you it was horrifying. Herb's son Kenyon was found in a different room in the basement. He was tied to a couch and had also been bound, gagged, and executed the same way his father had. Bonnie, the mom, was found in her room in the same manner as was Nancy, except she was the only one found to have a hole in the back of her head instead of the front. The police noticed this and started to wonder if it was possible that Nancy knew the assailant because she was the only victim who hadn't been facing the perpetrator when he pulled the trigger. Other than that, the cops in the community were completely stumped. I mean, this family had no known enemies, and not a single person in town had anything bad to say about them. After the discovery of the Clutter family, every hardware store in the immediate vicinity sold out of locks. Wow. Gone were the days of the tiny trusting town. There was a maniac on the loose, and it could have been anyone. For the first time ever, Holcomb County started to lock their doors. I can't believe people used to leave their front doors unlocked. Like, I would lock my pockets if I could. Those were the good old days. So one of the police who showed up to survey the scene was actually an expert photographer at the time. Even though the technology was nowhere near as good as it is today, the photos he took would actually become a key piece of evidence that would move the case forward. So aspiring photographers, don't let Aunt Gertrude tell you that photography isn't a real job, thank you. You need something to fall back on. You might just end up solving a crime case. So suck it, Aunt Gertrude, suck it. So the police took photos of every room and detail in the house with painstaking precision. They photographed the bodies, dusted for fingerprints, and interviewed the neighbors. And the only trace of an intruder that they could find was a single footprint next to Herb's body. Since it was known that the family was wealthy, the police wondered if they could have been a robbery gone wrong, but they realized the only thing missing from the house was a portable radio and a pair of binoculars. Weird, right? I mean, obviously it's known that they were a rich family. So why would you only steal those things if money was the motive? Was money not the motive? There was also one detail that the police discovered that really threw them. On the same day that the family was executed, Herb had actually taken out a $40,000 life insurance policy. After the discovery of the policy, the money went straight to his two adult daughters, Ivana and Beverly. But did they really think that Herb's own daughters were the ones who planned his own demise? Or is it possible that Herb actually knew what was going to happen to him and took it out as a precaution? And oh, how the casserole thickens. So the detectives looked into the life insurance policy, and as it turned out, it was pure coincidence. Apparently, the life insurance policy was a plan that Herb had actually been working on for a few months, and he just so happened to finish it that fateful Saturday. But I mean, at least he finished it so that his two surviving daughters would get the money. I don't want to say it was lucky that it happened the way it did, but wow, that was a close one. And after the life insurance thing had cleared up, the police started talking to Nancy's boyfriend, Bobby. Bobby had spent the Saturday evening with the family and supposedly left around 10 p.m., which meant he was the last person to have seen the family alive. Nancy and Bobby were planning on going to see a midnight movie that evening, but Nancy's dad suggested that they see it Friday instead and spend Saturday night with the fam. The worst part is, Bobby knew that if he and Nancy had gone to see the movie Saturday night, his girlfriend might possibly still be alive. And as they kept digging, the investigators found out that Herb didn't actually approve of his daughter's choice in men. It's not that he didn't like Bobby, it's just that Nancy was 16 and she was already been dating Bobby for 3 years, so Herb didn't want her to settle. Besides, Bobby's family was Roman Catholic and the Clutters were Methodist, so clearly it wasn't going to work out, so Herb apparently asked Nancy to slow the relationship down a bit. A classic case of the star-crossed lovers who could never be together. Was this Romeo acting out of revenge, pulling the Jodi Arias card, if I can't have her, no one can? Also, if you haven't seen that episode, I suggest you watch that. So now, of course, Bobby was starting to become a little more interested to detectives. But after thoroughly exhausting the theory of Bobby pulling the trigger, it turned out that he was just a 17-year-old kid in the wrong place at the wrong time. Bobby was head over heels for Nancy, and after a polygraph test showed that he was innocent, he was dismissed as a suspect. But poor Bobby, even though the police no longer thought he was guilty, that didn't stop the community from hurling accusations. It actually got so bad that Bobby had to transfer high schools to get away from all the harsh judgment and comments. I can't even imagine what this poor guy had to go through. To find out that your girlfriend and her whole family had gone, and then you're pinned as a suspect? You deserve so much better, Bobby. I'm on your side. So the next avenue the police decided to go down was Herb Clutter's business rivals. They looked into them, but could hardly call them rivals. Each person they questioned had no motive to do this to Herb, and also had an alibi for that fateful night. So if it wasn't the daughters, it wasn't the boyfriend, and it wasn't Herb's business rivals, who was it? The freaking boogeyman? The police were baffled. How could an entire family be taken out in one night without a single enemy in this tiny town? What was the motive? By this point, the police were wondering if there was a motive. It was starting to feel like the villain was just some sick person who wanted to see what they could do to terrorize a small town. And that's when the local newspaper printed a page asking for tips and offered a reward of up to $8,000. So of course, tips started coming in like crazy because money, duh. Over 2,000 tips came in, and the police were completely overwhelmed and began to sift through them. Yeah, money's a big motivator for something like that, but I wonder how many people just made stuff up to try and score some dough. Wait, wasn't the population of this town like 270 people? Like, how did that work? A week after this hashtag slaying Sunday, let's not make that a trend, please. A funeral was held for the Clutter family. So friends and extended family all came out to pay their respects, including the only surviving Clutter daughters, Beverly and Ivana. And then this really weird thing happened at the funeral. As Beverly was talking to police, she let them know that she was engaged. She said her wedding was set for the following month and she was heartbroken that her family wouldn't be there. The cops told her that it would be a good idea to get hitched ASAP so she could take her husband's name just in case there was someone still out there looking for the last of the Clutters. And Beverly and the whole extended family was like, yeah, that is a good idea. We should probably do that, stat. And then they were like, your whole family's technically here now, and there's a minister. You know where this is going, don't you? Yeah, I kind of couldn't believe it either. So there in the middle of her own family's funeral, Beverly makeshift wedding ceremony is held and she gets married to her hubby. I don't think that weddings and funerals should mix. It's like oil and water, they just don't mix. I mean, I guess the whole thing was actually really moving and symbolic for everyone. The Clutter relatives described the event as a fairy tale wedding in the middle of a nightmare. Aw, that's nice. But I don't know, I wouldn't exactly want my wedding to be described that way. But to each their own, I guess. I'm not trying to sour anyone's sweet potato, but as days continued to pass, the community slowly grew more and more wary of the case that was going nowhere, and that the maniac was still out there. A small break in the case came when police looked over the photographs of the crime scene and they spotted something that they had never spotted before. In the photo, the footprint that was found next to Herb's body, officials were able to make out a separate print in the dust nearby. Apparently, the footprint in the dust was impossible to detect with the naked eye, but somehow the camera was able to pick it up. Okay, 1960s camera, we see you. Let's go. We stan you. So now the police knew that they weren't looking for one suspect, they were looking for two. Now, towards the end of November, the police were notified that a Kansas State inmate named Floyd had come forward with a tip after he heard about the reward money. Floyd told the investigators he was a handyman who had worked on the Clutter's farm for 10 years. He was around 19 years old when he started working for the family and told investigators that they were all super nice. Floyd said that he loved the time he spent working for them. Like, Herb even gave him a $50 bonus on Christmas, which would be around, $450 today, which, like, as a handyman at the time, I have to imagine you're like super stoked about this kind of bonus. I know that I would be. Eventually, Floyd left the farm and bounced around from job to job until one day he was caught trying to steal a lawnmower from a store and got arrested. I'm really trying to think of how one can just sneak out of a store with a whole ass lawnmower. Like, what? This story is really sad, but it also has some of the wildest and funniest details I've ever heard, and I think that's kind of beautiful. Floyd was sentenced to 5 years in prison for stealing a lawnmower. He was put in a cell with a guy named Richard. And of course, when you're sitting in a slammer with nothing but time, you eventually get to know each other's life stories. The two got to talking and discussed the jobs that they used to have. And at one point, Floyd told Richard about this really wealthy farmer he used to work for named Mr. Clutter. Richard asked him just how rich the Clutter guy was. Floyd told him that he once saw the man take out a bunch of cash from a safe and pay one of the biggest bills Floyd had ever seen in his life. Then Floyd told Richard that the following week he watched Herb spend $10,000 on his family alone. And after that, Richard continued to ask Floyd about the Clutters over and over again. He even asked them the ages of the kids, how the locks in the house worked, and where Herb actually kept the safe. Is that a normal thing that people would ask their cellmates in the 50s? I mean, I wouldn't know. I wasn't around back then. Well, after that, the oh-so-quizzical Richard was paroled. He hit up one of his fellow ex-convicts named Perry and devised a plan. The two decided that they were going to drive to the Clutters' residence, steal the safe, and start a new life in Mexico. So on Saturday, November 14th, the two criminals completed their 400-mile trek across Kansas to the Clutter residence. As dawn broke that Sunday, while the tiny town slept, Richard and Perry crept inside the unlocked house. They searched everywhere for the safe, but they couldn't find it, so they woke up the family and demanded the safe's location. And it's important to note that while Floyd might have seen a safe full of cash when he worked there as a teen, but by the 1950s there was a huge push in America to ditch cash and write checks instead. Herb insisted to the guys that there wasn't a safe because he paid for everything with checks, but said he could give the men what little cash that he had. Well, that really pissed Richard and Perry off, so they tied up the family and continued to search for the safe. But after the pair realized that Herb was telling the truth, they debated if they should leave any witnesses behind. Perry was the one who eventually made the cynical call. After the decision was made, Richard and Perry executed the family members one by one. They left the crime scene with a small radio from Kenyon's room, pair of binoculars, and less than $50 in cash that Herb had on him. That's devastating. Richard and Perry fled to the Kansas City area where Richard wrote a series of bad checks. Then the two amigos decided to hit up Mexico. They pawned the binoculars and planned to hitchhike through California. But on December 31st, 1959, Richard and Perry were caught in Nevada after stealing a car, and their life on the lam was over. Investigators found the boot in the car that made the print next to Herb's body, and finally they knew they had their guys on lock. Richard and Perry went on trial, where it was decided that they deserved the ultimate punishment for their crimes and were sentenced to be hung. Finally, the family had justice, and the town town was able to sleep soundly again, knowing that the men were no longer on the loose. But they continued to sleep with their doors locked after that. And that is the insane story of the Clutter family and the senseless crimes committed by two ex-convicts who just needed a little cash. It's no wonder that this was the case that kind of took the country by storm. I mean, these random brutal slayings sound like something out of a fiction book. But if you're just as true crime obsessed as me, you know that sometimes the truth can be scarier than fiction. My mom thinks it's a bit weird that you can be obsessed with something like true crime, but oh well, I am what I am.